1762, this building was created in the East End of London in Whitechapel, the venue for these monthly talks. Very atmospheric building, still with its ancient neck-high pews, each with a door numbered, cushions on the seats for the front rows only. If you arrived late for church, you had an uncomfortable seat, so there was an incentive. And really, as it was 300, 250 years ago. Talk is a quite esoteric subject, blackletter printing and cursive scripts, past and present. Our speaker this evening is, well, he doubles actually, both as the technological whiz for these talks, and tonight as the expert behind the subject. Immo, the speaker in question, Immo Hüneke, has been associated with this church for more years than he can really remember, because his father was a pastor at the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Church in Forest Hill, southeast London, and that church was very closely linked, is very closely linked with this church. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German martyr, whose statue today is outside Westminster Abbey, knew this church very well, had a church which he also was pastor of around the corner from here in East London. And Immo's father was pastor at the Forest Hill Church, which now bears his name, Dietrich Bonhoeffer Kirche. So Immo grew up in this country, went to school here, and he told me before this talk that his interest in the subject comes through his uncle, who discussed German blackletter type scripts with him when he was young. A schoolmaster by profession, Immo's uncle, and Immo has acquired the knowledge through this, I presume, a favorite uncle. But anyway, I'm going to hand over now to Immo, who is going to present the talk. A member of the committee of this church, like myself. And so, Immo, over to you. We look forward to it very much.
Can you hear me? Okay. Let me share my screen so that people online can see what we're seeing. Okay, I hope everyone's seeing that. And there's no strange things on the screen. Wonderful. Yes, and then clear up some possible misconceptions about what this typeface is all about, and some history and what's happening today. So I'm not an expert, I'm more an enthusiast, and so please bear with me. I've assembled a lot of information. Okay, so looking at the early history of script styles. It's not moving on. Yes, there we go. We trace the history all the way back to Roman times. They used a font called Capitalis, or Capitalis Quadrata as well. I'm not quite sure what the distinction is. And from that evolved three different styles. There's a cursive Roman, or Roman cursive style, which is a kind of handwriting that you would use on clay tablets or slates, or indeed on paper with a stylus. There's something called rustica, which is very similar to the capital writing, but designed for writing using a quill pen. And uncial. Now, uncial is a term that we use to describe small letters. So as writing developed from classical times, people started writing it small. So they stylized the letters to be small. today we use the mixture of capitals and uncials. From that developed a further style called half uncial, which was, I think, if I'm not entirely mistaken, mainly used in Ireland and in those sort of early Christian books. And from that developed the classical Carolingian minuscule under roughly commensurate with the reign of Charlemagne, which is why it's called Carolingian. Minuscule means it's all lowercase. From that, we get a Gothic minuscule, which is the direct pre-cursive scripts. All of these are still handwritten, but in a different line of development, we get a sort of humanist minuscule, particularly in the Francophone and Latin world, and directly descended from the cursive style of Roman, we get the sort of round hand, which is the standard for handwriting in the Western world today. Does anybody recognize this building? It's the Parthenon in Rome, and you see the classic capitalis font that was used for the inscription. And what's missing? Lowercase, exactly. Here's an example of the uncial style. I think this is actually Book of Kells. Next example of rustic, and as you can see, it looks very much like capitalis, but just with little serifs and other elisions to make it more easily handwritten. That is an actual example of Roman cursive script. And I've also got, I can't decipher this, so I don't know what it means. You can possibly see individual letters, but a lot of it is gobbledygook. I don't even know what language that was. Here's a comparative example saying this is the older and the newer style of Roman cursive, and you can see that it's really tending towards a kind of a Latin lowercase, well, mixed case writing at that point. Here's an example of half uncial. I think it's from a catalogue of some kind, or possibly a table of contents at the front of a book. And this is the classic Carolingian minuscule that you can find in lots of books from the 8th, 9th century onwards. From that developed two other minuscules, the Gothic minuscule, which is like this. As you can see, the monks in scriptoria started to feel that the script wasn't pretty enough, so they started decorating it with lots of little decorative strokes. That's the best way I can put it, and also using color. And then, of course, there were the illuminated capitals at the beginning of each chapter, which took much longer. And on the other hand, the humanist minuscule, which developed off that, has nothing to do with humanism as a spiritual faith or direction. But this starts to look much more like, Latin type. And this is just an example of a round hand from the 18th century. I think this is somebody called John Ayres who wrote this. As it says, Ayres in the bottom left-hand corner. And you can see the curlicues, the fanciful dragons and swans and goodness knows what. So that's the older part of the history until we come to printing. So when we look at the bench of printing, now this is printing with movable type as devised by Johannes Gutenberg. Printing was actually invented in the Far East. The Chinese and the Koreans were doing printed works as long ago as 2,000 years. They even had printing with metal type, movable metal type, at least 100 years before Gutenberg. But there is no evidence at all that that knowledge penetrated into the West. And there are some significant differences. For example, Gutenberg used an alloy of antimony, lead, and tin, which has a far lower melting point than the brass that was being used in the Far East. And this enabled him to churn out large numbers of these individual types from matrix, which is created in brass rather than having to be made individually per letter from clay. The Chinese used a sort of lost clay method to make each individual movable type, so they were very, very valuable and hard to make. So I think the statistics are that it took 5 years to make an assortment of a few thousand movable types, whereas a print manufacturer in Europe was able to churn out several thousand a day of these. Now, if you look carefully, unfortunately, the resolution isn't good enough on the screen. What you see there is a typesetting box. In German, it's called a Winkelhaken. And the individual types had to be picked out of the box, where they were sorted into different little compartments and inserted individually in there. So it was quite a lengthy process. And if you wanted justified type, left and right, it was even longer, because somebody had to come along with spacers and carefully insert them between the letters to make the lines come out equal length. So this is how it's assembled. And here you can see a workshop. I think this is an illustration by someone like Dewar, showing how a print workshop works. And on the left-hand side, you can see these are the actual compositors who have to pick out the individual types. You can see each of them's got a text in front of them. They're assembling, using their Winkelhaken, they're assembling lines of type up to 4 or 5 deep. And then they're passing those to the typesetter, who's in the middle of the picture. And he's got another one of these manuscript proofs in front of him. So he's having to check the work of the original typesetters. And it's all in mirror writing, of course, so quite a skill. And he's assembling a whole page out of blocks of 4 or 5 letters, 4 or 5 lines of type each. Then slightly over further to the right, you'll see somebody with 2 sponges in their hand. These are leather bags, effectively, which are filled with a sort of spongy material. And they dip those in the ink, which was made from soot and oil, and carefully dab them all over the printing plate. So what this typesetter, this compositor on the left, has done is he's created a printing plate. So the chap in the middle is inking it up. Then slightly to the right of that is the printer himself, who's laid the sheet of paper on the printing press and is now, for all he's worth, screwing down the press to exert the pressure and transfer the ink onto the paper. And then that chap in the middle at the very front is assembling the finished sheet into a book. You can see on the very right, you can see the printed sheets hanging up to dry. So it's quite a long-winded process. No automation there at all. Here is an example of a Gutenberg press which has been reconstructed and is situated in the Museum of Printing in California. Now, what did they produce on that stuff? Well, the early printed products were trying to imitate manuscript. So they had a great deal of variants of the letters to make it look as though it's handwritten, and also to save space. So they used ligatures and abbreviations an awful lot, because paper was precious, and the fewer pages you could print a book on, the better. So there was a 42-line Bible printed by the Gutenberg's press, using this font called Textura Quadrata. So this is one of the very earliest printed Textura fonts. This one was made in 1482. Came from Venice, but it's in Latin. It's in a broken font, which is an interesting combination. I think you find that some of this stuff was still made from put music into print. That was one of the compositors' capabilities. So they used larger wood blocks or possibly copper plate in a separate print. But printing industry soon developed and standardized. And just to explain how movable types are made, you have to make a stamp, first of all, which is done by counterpunching and punching. So the raw punch, and this is used time and time again. So you put the counterpunch, the blank for the counterpunch, into the vise, which is the thing on the left, and then you drive the punch into it to make a groove. Then you take that punched or counterpunched piece of metal and file it down, so you end up with the shape that you are trying to approximate. Because this is a negative, you'll see that the holes in the letter you want to make are in fact the bits that stand out on the punch. Then you turn the whole thing around, you put another blank into the vise, and you drive the punch into that, and you can see it makes those two little holes, and then you file down the outside to make the letter you actually wanted in the first place. Quite a laborious and skilled job. And you see somebody cutting stamps to make that. The next stage in the process then is you've got your letter on the punch. This letter is now not a mirror image, it's the actual shape of the letter you want. That's then driven into a block of brass copper, or sometimes iron, which distorts the block, but they've deliberately allowed a bit of extra space, square and neat block of the right dimensions. And then number 5, you can see, is the after pouring metal into that mold. It's not just this, by the way. There's a kind of a collar that gets on top of this matrix to make the complete mold, and then they pour a lot of metal in. And once it's cooled down, you just pull the collar out, and you can push this out of the middle using a center punch. And there's your finished letter. Now later, particularly with the advent of the linotype machine, people invented a process of generating these matrices direct. So a type designer would actually create a template for the letter you wanted to cut. And then using this pantograph device, it was miniaturized using a router or drill. First, you'd cut out number 2, you'd cut out to shoulder height, the basic outline. And then number 3, you'd use a finer router or drill to trace around the outline of the actual letter itself, and make the raised surface that's going to so this one has to be done in negative, doesn't it? Because you're going to sorry, you're making the matrix, which is a positive, but it's negative in terms of depth. So you can see number 4, a movable letter that's been cast out of that matrix. So you have to understand these bits of technology to understand why letters shaped the way they are. When you're printing, ink tends to squidge out around the edges of letters, and so the stamp cutters were very keen to make sure that those would go in the direction they wanted, and that's why we've got lots of these little feet on the end of letters, on the end of individual strokes. They would basically channel the excess ink to where it was wanted. So going back to the lineage of typefaces, you'll see that on our earlier chart, we ended up with the Gothic minuscule on the one side, and this is all the things that have descended from that. So we get 3 basic families of typefaces directly descended from that, which are cursive, also known as proto-Gothic or pre-Gothic, rotunda, which is very similar to the Carolingian minuscule, and texture, which is much more like the sort of Gothic writing that you see in medieval manuscripts. On the left-hand side, you can see that descended from those are so-called bastarda fonts, And from those are descended the various calligraphic and cursive handwriting styles. In the middle, we see something called Schwabacher, which is a font that tried to combine best characteristics of all three families. And that was very, very popular for a long time. And there were even new versions of it invented from 1870 and later than that. From the texture, we get a style called chancery or Kanzlei, as well as the later very simplified Gothics, which we'll come on to. But the biggest family of all is the Fraktur, which means fractured, as you can imagine, broken style. So we get the earliest ones in the Renaissance, and it went through a revival in the Baroque period. People then tried to mirror developments that were taking place in Roman alphabets by making them simpler. In the Biedermeier period, these types of typefaces became a little bit more florid and very popular. And then there are more artistic variants of Fraktur, which began to emerge in the early 20th century. I've got some samples of each of these. So here's your cursive Gothic, and as you can see, it's now quite easy to read because it looks a little bit like the Latin alphabet, particularly the major letters. They were using something that was very similar to the rustic Roman for capitals. You might notice that there's a strange sort of letter that looks a bit like an F but isn't, and that's the so-called long S, and we'll come to speak about that more. So you get syllables, long S elsewhere, including ligatures where they're combined with other letters. There was one here somewhere. Oh yes, you can see the ligature of A and E. That's quite important because we'll come to talk about these kinds of ligatures where two letters which have a convex member where they meet will often run together. And in fact, in Scandinavian languages, you still see this today. This is one. This is the early rotunda typeface, but it's actually a digital recreation called San Marco, made in 1991 by Carl Georg Hofer. The text is an ancient Roman text by the physician Celsus. Again, you can see the AE. You can see the long S. So this becomes a fairly common characteristic. What you also see is that some letters have got a line above them, and that was again a sort of printer's abbreviation for, in this case, an M. So you've got second line from the bottom, right at the end, it says numerum. This one is Textura on the left-hand side, again by Carl Georg Hofer. It's called Notre Dame. And as you can see, they were using kind of ornate capitals in variant colors and that kind of thing. So it does very much resemble medieval manuscript. Whereas the one on the right is called Manuscript Gotisch, which was produced in 1899, again in a reproduction of what you might call the classic Gothic style. This is an interesting example because William Caxton, who brought printing to the United Kingdom, or England at any rate, had done quite a few years of apprenticeship in the Netherlands. And he brought this Bastarda typeface back with him. It's got a very lovely capital S, as you can see, very proud. It's almost like waving a flag or a ship on the sea. And this happens to be the beginning of St. Mark's Gospel in the King James Version of the Bible in that font. This is a good example of the original Schwabacher style. This is from Luther's Bible, printed by Johannes Gutenberg's press, but obviously not by Gutenberg himself, because Luther's translation of the Bible emerged in 1517 or thereabouts. It was a bit later, wasn't it? Anyway, Gutenberg was almost a century before Luther, but his business was still running. So as you can see, it's reasonably easy to read, but some of the capitals are a bit weird. So for example, if you look at the word error on the fourth line, the A has been split at the top, and the cross stroke has moved almost to the baseline. So a lot of people mistake that for a U. And we've got an H on the sixth line there, capital H, which again is a little bit idiosyncratic. And there's a few other letters like that. But in general, it's because it was widely used and popular. It was used. People became used to that and just read it as normal. S is another one. I sometimes find when I use Schwabacher that people mistake the S for a capital G, because that little serif that's tacked onto the bottom joins back up to the upper part of the snaky part. Those are the technical terms, by the way. On the right-hand side, you see a text called Teuerdank, which was printed by Johann Schönsberger in 1517, Augsburg. It's a sort of hymn, a sort of hymn to the emperor at the time, the Holy Roman Empire. So Imperial Secretary Vinzenz Wöchner was the model for the handwriting, but this is actually printed. I think, yeah, I've got a couple more Schwabacher examples. The top one is an actual instruction in how to write fine documents by Johann Neudorfer. That appeared in Nuremberg in 1519. And the bottom one is from the title page of Albrecht Dürer's textbook on measurement, Unterweisung der Messung. And you can see that at the time, orthography was anything but standardized. But Albrecht Dürer mentions his own name in there. And if you look very careful, the R of Albrecht does not match the R of Dürer. And I'll come to talk about why that is. Then we came to a revolution in the 19th century, because Ottmar Mergenthaler had emigrated from Germany to the United States, had this brilliant idea. He thought, instead of molding individual movable letters from matrices, why don't we actually assemble all the matrices in a line and cast an entire line at a time? And that sped up the process enormously. On the left, you see the linotype model 5CS, which was manufactured in Germany under license. And you can see it today in the Deutsche Museum in Munich. And you can see that there are four main components here. The magazine contains all the little copper blocks or brass blocks containing the matrices, which drop down when selected by the keyboard. So you can see that the type operator sits at the keyboard and they press the key. It's much bigger than a computer keyboard or typewriter keyboard. So it takes quite some strength to operate. But as they select one of the keys, the corresponding block drops down into the little hopper at the bottom and slides left into the assembly, where the whole line is gradually assembled. And then there's an operation to justify the line if you want to do that. At which point, these space bands get pushed in. It's a very clever system because, unlike computer typesetting, these are actually wedge shaped. So you've got infinite adjustability, and they just put as many spaces in there as you needed between words and push them up until the line was justified. So once the line had been assembled, then the hot metal is poured in. There's a device for rapidly cooling it and ejecting the line into a gradually growing box of type, which would be a whole column. And then the molds are immediately recycled. There's an elevator on the left-hand side, which puts them back up into the distributor. And the distributor has a very clever mechanism for recognizing each little matrix mold and plopping it back into the correct channel, so as to be selected again by the typesetter. Any questions about that? On the right, you can see an example of a cast line. You can actually see where the spaces have gone in. And so you see the view from the top, which is the printing surface, which is the kind of negative of what you want to see on the page. And then you could got a profile view to show how those letters are shaped. It's using this tin antimony lead alloy, which has a reasonably low melting point, somewhat higher than solder, but not much higher. And these can be assembled not just into flat printing plates, but also onto rotary presses, so they're used for printing newspapers. So I talked earlier about Schwabacher, and this is one of the new Schwabacher fonts that you can see. It's very similar to the old, but you can see that they've simplified letters such as capital H and capital S to make them easy to read. Can't actually see a capital A in this example. And here is one example of the Chancery font. This one's quite interesting because it comes from Switzerland. And you can see that Swiss doesn't have the SZ ligature, Swiss German. So they've had to actually combine on the fifth line at the end. You can see that they've actually combined a long S and a Z as two separate letters rather than ligature. They're just kerned slightly together. Yes, kerning is something I don't mention elsewhere. It's where you take one of the letters and overlap it slightly with another one. Many of the molds were actually designed that way, so that when you cast the letter from it, it would be slightly narrower than the letter itself. So then we come into the family of genuine Fraktur typefaces. So this one during the Renaissance, as you can see, is very closely allied to the textura type. But pretty soon people found that was too dense to read, and particularly if it was a small type, small point sizes, they wanted something simpler. So this is a very good example of a Baroque typeface. It's called Breitkopf Fraktur. And this piece of text is from Immanuel Kant's An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? And you can see that the whole picture is less dense and dark, so it makes much easier to read. You can see the letter S, for example, has become stylized even more. Line 5 at the beginning. You can see that the actual S shape has become detached in the middle, and the little off stroke has replaced that. So some of these things were a little bit fanciful, and could indeed lead to confusion on the part of the reader. If you look, for example, the second line from the bottom, the second to last word says Verstandes. Well, that's a V, which in German is pronounced F. But it looks a lot like a B, doesn't it? So people did get confused with those. So a chap called Johann Friedrich Unger and one or two other people were seeing what's happening in Roman fonts at the time and decided to basically go back to basics with all this. So he designed a font and he made various attempts at this until eventually it appeared in 1794 to disambiguate those kinds of problems. So, for example, on line 3 at the end, you can see a capital B, which is very clearly different to the capital V, which is in line 5 near the middle. Or actually, at the very, very top, you see my erster Versuch, my first attempt as a new German typeface. So this particular sample comes from a book called Die Neue Cecilia by Carl Philipp Moritz, which appeared in 1794, and in an extensive foreword by Graham himself, he explains the reasons for this typeface being used. It didn't really catch on until much later. So in the 20th century, it became very popular. However, this is completely useless, isn't it? I have a lovely example of a well-known text set using Biedermeier. On the right-hand side, you can see an example. That's the boldface of the normal Fraktur, and the left-hand side was going to be book. So just a quick excursion into calligraphy. This is a sort of, a guide as to how to write using I think it was initially a quill pen, but this particular style developed after the development of the steel nib, which had a very clear distinction between strokes made horizontally and vertically because it had a width to it. So you could write very fine lines by drawing the nib sideways, and quite thick lines by drawing it across. So this is why the kind of slanting appears here, to bring out that contrast. And of course, you'll find that when you're writing with a steel nib, it's quite easy to draw the nib downwards or sideways, but if you're trying to go back up the other way, it tends to dig into the paper and splash. So these fonts were actually these typefaces, they're writing styles, were deliberately devised to avoid that. And you can actually find guidebooks that tell you how to turn the nib, which order to do the strokes, in order to make these very fine shapes. But of course, it's quite difficult for anyone to learn. Here is a letter written by Goethe in his own hand. Can't remember what it's about, but you can see he also starts off with a very ornate capital W, and quickly degenerates into what looks a bit like a doctor's handwriting, doesn't it? Because you want to write fast, but with a bit of practice, you could do that using a steel nib. It still needed to be charged up again from the inkwell every few minutes. So in the early 20th century, the Prussian Education Ministry in 1911 commissioned somebody called Ludwig Zitterlin, who was an educationist and handwriting expert, to devise 2 simplified alphabets. And the one on the right is what's today known as Zitterlin Schrift, which was designed for children to write on a slate with a crayon. In German, it's called Griffe. There's nothing similar, really. A Griffe is a pencil with chalk in the middle instead of pencil lead. So you could write on a slate and then rub it off. So I learned my first handwriting using this. Though I learned using an alphabet which is descended from the one on the left. A couple of years later, then a very enthusiastic school teacher called Fräulein Kreyenmeier, who was an enthusiast for this. She taught the entire class this Sutherland alphabet because she said, well, you know, it's part of your heritage. You need to be able to read letters and documents that were written like that in years past. And the children took to it. You know, they loved it because it's almost like a secret language for them.
Could I ask a question?
Please do, Frank.
In the past, I received letters written with the right hand script.
What you mean like that? Or like this?
No, the right hand one there.
Well, that's very, very clear and easy to read, isn't it?
To what extent can Germans these days read that?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes. So Frank's question was, to what extent are Germans today able to read this? I would say probably no more than 2 or 3 in 100, because since the 1970s, it's disappeared out of schools, and it's only, you know, when enthusiasts run courses that people get familiar with it. There's quite a few museums across the country which have sort of, much like the Black Country Museum, for example, they have schoolrooms which are set out in the way that schoolrooms used to be centuries ago, and there will be guidebooks like that, and occasionally people encouraged, particularly children, encouraged to have a go. So in that way, my daughter learned this, for example. My son wasn't so keen.
Both sides of that page would be described as.
Yes, indeed. I'll come on to that. Yeah. So they're both Sutherland schrift, but the one on the left has gone out of use. The one I learned was a descendant of this called Lateinische Ausgangsschrift, which had no author's name to it at all. But the one on the right is still pretty much unchanged. So that brings us on nicely to oddities and misconceptions. What does Gothic mean? Well, the Americans use Gothic to mean something completely different. For example, the font in which I did this presentation is called Century Gothic. But Europeans would call that a grotesque or a sans serif typeface. What it says at the bottom is this is Klingsborg Gotisch, but it's not, because unfortunately this computer doesn't have that font installed. Then we come to this oddity, upper and lowercase. So you saw the print workshop picture earlier, where compositors were taking individual letters. Obviously, the lowercase characters, the little characters, uncials, were needed much more frequently, and so they were put in a more convenient position. That's the lowercase. So you've got this case of individual sorted letters. And incidentally, you know, each compartment was known as a sort, or contained sorts. And a sort could be a character, a number, a punctuation mark, or a space. So if you ran out of them, you were out of sorts. That's where the saying comes from. And incidentally, when I showed you the Mergenthaler machine, the linotype machine had a rail at the bottom. So each of these matrices, each of these little blocks, actually had 2 molds in it. And by switching the rail one way or the other, you could choose. And typically that was used to distinguish between boldface or normal, or between normal and italic, depending on which magazine you'd loaded up. And that's why still to this day, printers refer to italic as upper rail and Roman as lower rail. Here's an interesting one, the umlaut. You can see this is an excerpt from a Wilhelm Busch book. And you can see that it's set in Schwabacher, Schwabacher. And the second line says läuft die Zeit. So you've got an A umlaut, and it was written as a little e. They'd gone away from using AE as a kind of ligature by then, and instead put the E on top of the other letter to save space. So on top of an A, an O, or a U. And then if you think about how from Gothic handwriting manuscript, the Spitze Schrift, the pointed German style handwriting developed. You can see that if you trace this letter, you've got a downstroke, a sort of a cross stroke, which is faint because it's written with a nib, and then another downstroke. And so that became stylized as two downstrokes like that. So you still see that in German handwriting. In fact, Zitterlin left out the cross stroke entirely, so you've just got two little parallel lines. And so this just becomes an A with two little diagonals on. You know, if this had the right type, it would show the Frühling font with the two diagonals, diagonal strokes exactly mirroring the little E in the handwriting. Then we have the vestigial R. As I mentioned before, the printers were always on the lookout to save space, and then they made a lot of space-saving ligatures. These, this happens to be the Wilhelm Klingspor Schrift, an example of it, which is a lot of, a rich selection of ligatures, including, you can see in third row from the bottom, at the beginning, it's got the AE ligature, which is very rare nowadays in German. Scandinavian names or something, and OE at the end. So you can see once again the common downstroke is kind of overlapped. And when you had that in a combination of, say, OR, AR, or PR, they would overlap the R onto the right-hand convex curve. So you can see that you end up with just the external bits of the R, the right-hand side of it. And so some inventive printer decided to take that bit on its own and use it as a letter R. And it obviously follows a vowel usually, or a P, or there's one or two other letters like G, which might follow. And I did have some examples of this. Yes, you see the word pastor in the bottom line. So that shows the rotunda R being used. And here's the longer one. This one is actually quite interesting. William Caslon, who lived from 1692 to 1766, produced this sample in 1763 in London. So the font used, I'm trying to think what it was. It looks like Old English, doesn't it? That's the style of type. And you can see that Mayors, so on, is spelled with a backward R. Sorry, oh, I've got too far. There we go. And you can also see some other ligatures there, like a double F, and bailiffs, and officers. And the word "or" in the top part is also written with a backward R. Oh yes, and you've got CT at the start of the second line. That's another ligature. So then we come to the long short. This is the S stretched vertically above and below the baseline to make a more space-saving S that you can fit in between other letters more easily. So you can see this in both Blackletter typeface and Roman typeface. Unfortunately, these examples are completely useless because they're not applying the correct font. Let's see if we can have an example. Oh, this is an example of it not being used because this is Troy type by William Morris. So this came much towards the end of the 19th century, and he's basically combined elements of what he considered to be sort of appropriate for things like Arthurian legends and such. As you can see, the capitals are all based on Art Nouveau typefaces, which are Roman typefaces, really. And the uncials are based largely on Bastarda variants, But as you can see, it's just got the round S. And this tends to be the tradition in the English language, so you just ignore the long S. But you can see it in many 17th and 18th century texts, even in Roman typefaces. Right, so here we go. In German, it's got voiced and unvoiced S. So to distinguish the sharp S, you know, printers started adding a Z at the end to render that sound, without shortening the vowel that precedes it. So pretty soon, these would be melded together into an S and a Z shape, which of course in German has got, it's like the number 3. I wish I could show you properly. So in Roman typefaces, when 2 consecutive letter S's were written, they often applied these rules for the short and long S. You can see that there, and that leads to this ligature. And you can actually just about see where that little S is, you know, the round S for the end has come out. It's just joined together at the top, really. And in Italian or in Latin, this doesn't actually imply any kind of change of pronunciation. But of course, in German, it would do. It would shorten the vowel that precedes. So to print text in Roman typefaces, German printers needed something. And they picked up this ligature and said, oh, that looks like how it's said, so we use it. And it's in use to this day, German and Austrian German, but not in Swiss German. They just use double S. We're starting to run short of time, so I'll go through this very quickly. But in the early 1800s, the number of printed works that appeared really took off, particularly with the wide range of newspapers and periodicals that appeared, and the journals, many books. And so we had a proliferation of publishing houses and printing firms all competing together. And there were dozens of type foundries that catered to their needs. And I've listed 10 of them here. These are the most well-known. We needn't go through those in detail. There was a lot of consolidation later. Because of the kind of parallel development of German orthography and these Fraktur, particularly Fraktur typefaces, they came to be associated very strongly with the German language. I still remember my school library finding an English-German dictionary in which all German text was written in Fraktur and all the English in Roman. For a while, after Napoleon was successful across Europe and North Africa, the French language had a very high standing. So there was kind of a reversal of fortunes for these German type scripts. But soon afterwards, the Fraktur and Courant once again enjoyed huge popularity and in fact became the so-called official alphabets of Prussia and a few other German states. Otto von Bismarck himself was said to have refused to read anything in a Roman face. However, there were at the same time, in the 1870s, efforts to reform the orthography because people thought that the way German was written was too illogical. I can't think why they thought that, because it's far less illogical than English, for example. But people are always trying to simplify things. So, for example, there was a convention in about 1870 something. I can't remember exactly when. 75, I think. Which came out with a recommendation to switch the orthography so that every sound, every phoneme would have just a single way of representing it in writing. So instead of PH and phi, you'd only have an F. Obviously, this was laughed out of court by the vast majority because they didn't want to learn a completely silly way of writing that ignores the historical roots of words, for example. But there was the foundation of something called the Verein für Altschrift. Now, Altschrift is an interesting term because it actually means Roman. It doesn't mean broken typefaces, which nowadays we consider to be old-fashioned. Altschrift was meaning the classical, so they were trying to revive more use of the Roman typefaces, which in German are called Antiqua. So that was obviously then was countered by other organizations being founded, such as the Allgemeine Deutsche Schrift, which was enthusiastic for the broken typefaces. In 1918, several of these came together to form the Bund für Deutsche Schrift, the aforementioned Association for German Script. Now that fell victim to a well-known political leader of the time. So there was this secret edict, and nobody knows why it's marked secret, but basically Hitler suddenly decided, after years and years of the Nazis building up, the various Fraktur and Schwabacher typefaces as being very German, and even actually prohibiting any Jewish printing firms from using them. Suddenly, it went 180 degrees around and described all blackletter typefaces as Schwabacher Jewish lettering, Schwabacher Judenlettern, and therefore they were no longer to be used in any official documents, and even amateur associations such as the BFDS were forced to wind up. However, because this was a secret, didn't really become well known until much, much later. In popular mind, the German typefaces remained associated with the National Socialist regime up to 1945, and there was not much enthusiasm for reviving them later. However, they have been used, particularly in sign painting and in religious works. These days, you find them mostly on labels of things like alcohol products, which try to appear traditional, very widely used on pub signs, and in the old town parts of German cities for street signs and such. The actual type foundries mostly went out of business due to war damage and also lack of demand after the war. There was massive consolidation into a few leading firms, and a lot of them emigrated abroad as well. And many of the exciting new typeface designers worked only in Roman styles. There were a few, particularly people who'd survived the war, who were still designing exciting new broken typefaces, but there's not that many. Alison and I went to Nuremberg in June, and this is a typical example of the sort of public signage that you find making use of these typefaces. This one actually has exemplary use of letters, probably because they've completely omitted the letter S. It's the entrance to a sort of artisan quarter at the edge of the Imperial Castle. And then, of course, in came phototype setting and computer technology, desktop publishing. It made printing and publishing much more accessible to the Roman industry, and so a huge cottage industry started to spring up. And this was started to cater individuals such as my uncle, who digitized traditional typefaces and then even started to design new ones in digital, which is what enabled me to do this presentation. So what can we do? Well, I'd suggest, if it interests you from a aesthetic point of view and just from cultural interest, do read some books about it. There's lots of articles on the internet. You can at least learn to recognize the different families of typefaces and where they should be used. You can use it in occasional stationery, such as invitations. And the Bund für Deutsche Schrift und Sprache, BFDS, has an international section. If you go to www.bfds.de, you'll find some basic information in English, which enables you to support the work. And that's about all I can tell you. Any questions?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Immo. That was most interesting. You said often that something was much easier to read. So there was a conscious development of complicated looking letters in opposition to it being much easier to read.
That's an interesting thing. Of course, you know, what's easy to read and what isn't depends very much on what you're used to. But
yes.
There were some scientific studies that show that particularly Fraktur typefaces can be picked up much quicker as a whole word picture because they're more varied than the equivalent word in Latin, in Roman.
What do you mean? So the look of the word is easier, is
because
more descriptive?
It's got a more distinctive shape.
Yes.
On average.
Yes.
Of course, there's only an average, and people have to be trained to be readers, you know, speed readers in both types of typefaces to make any significant impact. But it's reckoned that you can speed up reading between 10 and 20% by using reading German, of course.
Yes.
By using these typefaces.
The Gothic typefaces.
Yes, and particularly the ones that have been kind of simplified, made more. With less curly cues and things.
I see. That's counterintuitive to me. I would have thought that the Latin script on the front of the Parthenon, the Pantheon in Rome, the beautiful clarity of that is obviously much more easy to read than Gothic script, but it can work in the other way.
Actually, sequences of capital letters are probably the worst.
Yes.
I mean, it's easy to pick up when you first learning to read, but
yes,
imagine reading an entire novel written like that. It'd be horrible.
I see that. Yes.
Okay.
Well, that's really fascinating, Immo. Thanks so much, and so much learned about the beta sign and the umlaut, which we just accept from learning the language at the beginning without questioning it, but the origins of details of the German language in that.
I brought a sample of some books which are lying on top of the piano in the Mezzotzimmer. So let me see whether there's anybody asking questions online.
Yes.
If you put your question in the chat.
Would anyone like to ask a question? Jeff?
Do school textbooks simplify Latin style script?
Yes. Basically, there's something called Lateinische Ausgangsschrift, which I think across all the federal states in Germany has become the standard.
Following up on that, and reading the 10 commandments behind you with the exaggerated capitals that you mentioned on the long S, I wonder if young German school children would cope with that.
That's an interesting question because quite often at these museums where members of BFDS run writing courses and so on, they actually put a sample of text in front of young people and ask them to read it. And in most cases, they don't have any particular difficulty. There are certain letters which cause difficulties, like as I said, the capital V and capital S, which can be difficult to recognize. But in most cases, it depends on your motivation. You know, if for example, you were to typeset the lyrics of some popular song, using that, people would have no difficulty at all following. And I could say that because at the Bonhoeffer Church, until we got the new hymn books in 1988 or thereabouts, we were using hymn books that were typeset entirely in Alt Schwabacher, and nobody had any problems reading that. Okay, I mentioned Metzelzimmer. I believe there are some refreshments.
I believe there are too.
There weren't any questions from the floor.
So that means we have concluded this evening's formal part. As Immo said, there are some refreshments at the back and the books that he has brought along for us to see to compare scripts in. So Immo, that was fascinating, most interesting. Thank you so much for presenting this talk this evening. Thank you to all the people who tuned in this evening for your presence, and especially to those people who have come here to the church. So thank you all very much. That brings this season of talks to a close. We, as I said earlier, take August off, and then we will resume these talks in September this year. Offhand, I can't remember what the talk is in September, but I'll send details to all those on the meeting. From the hospital, might be. Oh, yes, you're right. It is. It's the broadcaster. Yes.
Academy of Ideas.
That's right, the Academy of Ideas. Yes, that should be very interesting. But I'll let you all know about that in due course. Have we now? You have. Good. So, thanks for coming.